morning all. I think it's time for us to start this webinar. This is going to be a really fun webinar, and in full disclosure, I'm actually zooming in from around the Joshua Tree area in California. I was taking some personal days this week and didn't want to miss what's going to be a fabulous conversation. So I have had some Wi-Fi difficulties and connection difficulties. So if you hear some noise in the background, I'll try and mute, but please be forgiving in that respect. Anyway, this is going to be a fantastic discussion leading into and for the future of education. I'm not going to go through the normal routine that we typically do of how you need to use Zoom, but you can actually make the screenshots or make the videos larger or smaller as you wish. If you do want to ask questions, we are going to have time for a Q&A at the very end. So please put those either in the chat box or even better, put them into the Q&A function and we'll relay those back to the speakers. This topic, before I introduce our speakers, really came out of the work that we do at BTS Spark around leading the next generation of education leaders and what they are going to require for the future. It's not just the issue of teaching a new set of skills to the students, but it's also, as we've seen over the last 2 years, the fact that we're going to have our schools be more nimble, be more efficient, be more able to make changes on the fly and changes very quickly. So the skills of the leaders in these schools is going to be critical to establishing those kind of changes in our schools moving forward. Yes, being a pedagogical expert will be important, but more so being that team leader that can really engage and bring people together. All right, enough of my chit chat. By the way, if you are interested, before I introduce everybody, we did have an article which was co-written by the people on your screen here, which is out in EdWeek as of Sunday. And the title is "The World is Changing." Let me get it exactly for you. The world is always uncertain. How should education leaders respond? And we asked all of the people who are panelists here and also a couple of school principals and superintendents from the Alliance for Excellent Education as well. And I'm sure we can put the link to that in the chat box. All right, enough of me chit-chatting. Let's move on and introduce you to our wonderful panelists. And please, when I introduce you, please come onto the screen and go off mute as well. Homer Tavangar is one of the co-founders of the Big Questions Institute. And for nearly 3 decades, Homer's work has bridged the topics from global competitiveness to global citizenship, economic development, storytelling, and the list goes on. Connects timely topics of the moment with timeless desire to work with purpose and make a difference. I think that I'd love to have that on my CV as well. We were talking earlier about Mark wanting to change his title, but I think what you've got there, Homer, sounds magnificent. So welcome, Homer.
Thank you so much, Sean. Great to be here.
And along with Homer, we have her other co-founder at the Big Questions Institute, Will Richardson, who was a former public school educator of 22 years and has spent the last 15 years developing an international reputation as one of the leading thinkers and writers about the intersection of social online learning, networking, education. If you haven't caught up with Will's blogs or his musings on LinkedIn, definitely worth linking in with him. And as you'll see, we've also got everybody's Twitter handle, so you can feel free to follow them as well. So good morning to you, Will.
Thanks, Sean. Great to be here.
Joining us, we also have Catherine Prince, who is Vice President at KnowledgeWorks. KnowledgeWorks is that great organization that starts to put out these forecasting reports, and I believe one has just come out recently as well, talking about what the future of education is all about, or what we can potentially expect or think about. So a very timely person to have on this panel. She's one of the US's foremost education futurists and leads Knowledge Works' exploration of the future of learning. So welcome, Catherine.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And as you can see, we've got a very full group of speakers and panelists today who we thought is going to be a really engaging conversation. We also are very happy to have Jose Vilson, who's the Executive Director of EduColor. Jose and myself met a couple of years ago when he was one of our speakers at the Whole Child Symposium. I think that would have been about 2 years ago, I believe, Jose, correct?
Well, 3, given, circumstances in the last few years.
You're right.
But thank you for having me.
Exactly. Well, I'm just forgetting about the last 2 years of that pandemic. But Jose Vilson is a veteran educator, writer, speaker, activist in New York City, and the author of This Is Not a Test, a new narrative on race, class, and education, and has written, as you can see, for a number of great organizations. So welcome, Jose.
Thank you.
And definitely last but not least, Mark Sparvel, who's the Director of Marketing Education at Microsoft. Mark is also a fellow Aussie, and as we say down under, he's also a fellow crow eater, which means he and I both come from Adelaide, the beautiful city of Adelaide, which is blessed with good food, good beaches, and good wine. Correct, Mark? Exactly. He is an award-winning educator with over 25 years experience leading improvements for school systems, higher ed, professional associations. And you'll see Mark's name pop up all over the place, from the US, North America, Canada, London, giving talks about the intersection of learning, social emotional learning, but also how learning can take place online as well. So welcome, Mark.
Great, pleasure to be here. Thanks, Sean.
All right. We're going to jump straight into it. So the first thing we're going to do is actually just dissect what this phrase means. And I'm going to give each of the panelists 1 minute just to talk about what does this phrase mean to me, leading into and for the future. And Homer, we're going to start with you.
Okay. Well, when I read leading into and for, I kind of think about leaning into and for the future, that we talk to a lot of educators all the time. And, one of the conclusions is that the future is here. And so it's a bit of an acknowledgement. Will and I talk a lot lately about radical acceptance, that we're here. And that preparation for the future, that sort of elusive conversation, that strategic foresight, like Catherine, I love her title, it is here. And I actually something very top of mind, I tweeted this morning, I got an ad from the Wall Street Journal on Instagram or Twitter or something about the Future of Everything conference. It's filled with themes, and education was not on there. And I thought that said a lot. Maybe we can talk about that, but the fact that they wouldn't even think of education to be included on that cutting edge list kind of says a lot. So leading into and for the future, I think it's here, and I think we cannot turn our back on it.
Wonderful. Yeah, couldn't agree more. It was it's strange to not have education included in that. If there's one industry that's actually planning for and based around the future, it is education. So it should be a fundamental core focus of any such conference. Fantastic. Will, over to you. Leading into and for the future.
Yeah, thanks. Can I just say what Homa said? Is that okay?
That's why we
Yes, you
work
can.
well together.
No, I know. In all seriousness, though, I mean, I'm not that shocked that education didn't show up. I mean, up until probably the last, I don't know if you surveyed today, since things have changed, especially here in the States recently in terms of like parental involvement in schools, but education never floats to the top of the lists when people are talking about the things that are most concern or, so, and it's certainly in politics that it's not at the top of many people's agenda. So that doesn't shock me, to be honest with you. I think, this question about leading right now is really interesting. And, we'll probably, Home and I will probably say we a lot today because we're kind of, joined at the hip when it comes to these conversations. But we talk a lot about how, the job description of a leader today is so much different from what it was 2 years ago, about how many different skills and dispositions and how much more knowledge and different knowledge bases that you have to have right now to be trying to lead any organization. And so it is here, I mean, and it is the type of thing where it's going to be constantly changing. I don't, you kind of think about, we talk about the 5-year plan as being kind of a chuckle these days, right? But it's almost like the job description is the same way. I mean, because depends on what week, that you're opening up that position or what's happening in that moment. So we'll talk more about this, obviously, but I think that leading right now is all about inquiry. It's all about asking questions, and it's all about being okay without having answers, because that's kind of the way the world is spinning right now.
Yeah, I think we could almost wrap up this webinar right now after the first 2 responses to those questions. We've hit on almost every point we need to, but I couldn't agree more. I think what's really happened the last 2 years is it's changed our understanding of what leading really means. It's not just, right, this is the schedule, here are the benchmarks, here are the things you can and shouldn't be doing in school, this is the bus timetable, and that's it. We're in a brand new world, and I think people are starting to realize that. Jose, I'm going to turn it over to you for your 1 minute.
I think generally
leading into and for the future.
Yes, when we think about the future, I think generally we find that there's a lot of conversation about how we use tools, and that ends up being the future conversation instead of how can we reorganize schools more generally? How can we rethink, for example, about how schools are organized, what roles are being taken on, what context are we actually seeking and looking for when it comes to the future of education? Because so much of it is right now the discussion is always about what tools we need to use and what technology is going to be out there, instead of thinking to ourselves, what do we actually want out of this, and can we find a common principle by which to approach this thing we call education? So I think that leading into it is really going to be about like who has great ideas for how we can learn socially, how we can learn together, how we can learn in ways that allow for us to actually build a future together.
And I think, not to state the obvious to this panel, but I think having more conversations from people like all of you who are talking about what we get out of education, what the purpose of education is, and not having it talked to us by people who may have invented the next whiz-bang tool that might help. But we really need to spend this time talking about what the purpose of education is. Catherine, maybe you can illuminate us a little bit on your thoughts, but also some of your findings from that report. I'm sure some might fall into this phrase.
Absolutely. And I think that sense of having a shared understanding of what we want for the future and is absolutely critical. That shared purpose, having some sense of a shared destination, whether it's a specific shared vision or some common values that people hold together as we co-create the future. We really focus on, let's be aware of how the world is changing. Let's think about it, what it could mean for us where we sit. So what are opportunities on the horizon? What are challenges? But ultimately, how can we channel all of that so that we can create futures where everybody can thrive? And then also, helping learners and other people develop the capacity to navigate change and uncertainty, knowing, we'll get a sense of what we want, and circumstances around us, of course, just keep shifting. So our latest future forecast that you alluded to, Sean, is called Imagining Liberatory Education Futures. So it looks out to the year 2040 to explore how we might really put people at the center, how we might really kind of counter a lot of the current oppressive structures and systems that are present in education and other social systems to help people, you know, have more scope to thrive and to determine the course of their lives.
Yeah, and I'm similar to you as well, in that I'm actually really buoyed by the fact that when you look at all the reports that have been coming out recently, whether it's the WISE All In, whether it's the OECD Future of Education 2030, whether it's Michael Fullan and his work as well, or the work that you're talking about and releasing, it has a basis of the person and the learner at the center, and the value proposition about what we would like them, but also what we would like society to gain and grow from education. So yeah, I look forward to reading that. And yeah, if you haven't put that into the chat, Catherine, put the link to that report in there as well, and we'll put a link to the article too. Mr. Sparvel, over to you, leading into and for the future.
Right on. Good being at the end of such an esteemed group of thinkers. Thanks for that, Sean. I guess, you know, I'd swap out that first word into a conversation around learning into and for the future. And, you know, if I noodle around this topic, these are the things I think about. One is events over the last couple of years, right up into today, have proved one thing, that the future is very hard to predict. So notions of a fixed future mentality, skills for the future, preparing for the future, jobs of the future. It's interesting. Like, it's interesting to think about those fixed future concepts in the light of the last couple of years and start to noodle on, in education, are we talking about probable futures or preferred futures? And if there are preferred futures, then schools become places where society is created and recreated, not just simply places to acquire knowledge and be validated on that knowledge. So, you know, those are the things I think about. When I think about the function of leadership and reflect back on my work as a school leader, it seems that there's a new set of skills and dispositions that are suddenly incredibly important. One of them would be contextual intelligence. I'm sure there's a smarter word for it, but the ability for education leaders, ministries, system leaders, you know, to be able to understand, to read and listen at scale, adapt and respond according to the context that they're in. It's this sort of hyper personalization of leadership, of learning.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And actually, I just pulled up the quote that we had at the end of the article, which has a message from you, which says, this premise was echoed by Mark Spavel, who reminded us that if we believe that schools are places where society is created and recreated, then we need to accept the frightening and amazing opportunity we have to literally create preferred futures and not stagger towards inevitable probable futures. Now, really, it comes down to the time is now, and it's up to us to take hold of this time and not let it slip beyond our grasp. Because if we, as you know, to use the phrase thought leaders or leaders in education, give up this opportunity, then somebody else is going to take over and somebody else's agenda is going to head to the fore. Let me move on to the first question. Excuse me, a little bit of a technical issue there. Let's jump into this, the first question. And so it's really just asking, what are the skills and mindsets that our school leaders will need to lead our schools into the future? So here we're not talking so much about what we're going to be teaching. It's really about what do our schools need in order to be prepared for this future, which is coming at us pretty quickly. And I'm not sure who would like to take the first bite at this one, but I think this might open us up to a bit of a discussion. So skills, maybe I can turn to you, Will, because you touched on this in the introduction. So talk a little bit more about the skills needed for leading.
Well, I think, you know, there are some skills obviously that aren't going to change. I think leaders have to have a sense of vision, have to have an ability to motivate people to, you know, explain and make the case for whatever it is that they're doing or trying to change. And that, you know, some of that will always be required, but again, one of the more universal skills that we talk a lot about now is just sense making, right? Because the world is increasingly more difficult to make sense of. And we live in what some people are calling a post-truth world, where, you know, truth is relative. We have our own set of facts. If that's one of the great quotes from the last, you know, 5 or 6 years. And so leaders need to make sure that the information that they have, the networks that they're building, the people they're interacting with, have validity, and that they are able to take this complexity and not only make sense of it for themselves, but then communicate that in ways to the people who they are leading, so they too have the capacity then to make decisions with some semblance of coherence, right? That there has to be some shared understanding from which we begin to move forward. And so I think that's probably the most important thing right now. I think that a lot of what we know about our lives, especially again here in the States, you know, I don't think it's hyperbole to say that democracy itself is at risk, because we are really struggling with sense making right now. And so if leaders don't have that skill and aren't really adept at it, it doesn't matter what setting, whether it's education, business, politics, whatever else, we're gonna struggle mightily, and I think we already are.
Yeah, it's really that idea of vision making that comes to the fore, and understanding what our purpose is in schools. And as you were saying, if we don't start to take control of that, then somebody else is going to start to take control of that. You also touched on some other mindsets that are needed about the communication to others and engaging others, bringing them on board as well. So it's not just that leader that's directing and saying, all right, this is the way we're going to go, which is becoming more and more difficult in these ambiguous times. But it's that leader who can convey a sense of vision and value, and can also bring people along with them as well.
And I think it's really important that leaders share power and really think about finding ways to engage in participatory leadership. So to really think about co-creating that destination and co-creating the ways toward it, not just with even the people who might report directly to them or work for their organization, but with their broader kind of stakeholders and constituents. So in a school's case, not just the people who work there, but also people from the broader community. And really listening very authentically to the people they're working alongside and with, and also trying to foster environments in which people can connect in authentic ways one-to-one, so that there's this real sense of kind of shared community, you know, shared interactions that are the basis of kind of moving toward that future.
On the mindset piece, you know, I mean, a mindset is, you know, it's a way of thinking that guides how we process information about the world, and therefore how we respond and react to the world. And, you know, it's something that we can learn and change with, thanks to sort of neuroplasticity. It's a habit that we can kind of foster. I've been interviewing executive leaders for my podcast series, Super Speaks, and especially about how they've navigated great challenge, difficulty, and turbulence over the last couple of years, and how they're leading forwards from that point. And a couple of observations from those podcasts. One, they inspired me. No wonder their districts are doing well too, because there's something in their clarity of purpose. There's something in their passion and commitment. But if you dig down into mindset, two things, I mean, not to sort of just quote it for the sake of quoting it, they really do have that growth mindset. You know, every one of those superintendents and executive leaders basically had this mindset of, what is this teaching me? As opposed to, why is this happening to me? You know, they had flipped it around and were looking for the opportunities that existed within the challenge and the tension. That gave them perspective. And for those around them, it gave them hope, which was really important right now. The other would be, they all consistently across the globe, from the Philippines to Canada or the US, they had this beginner's mindset. Like when I learned to snowboard a few weeks ago, they approached things with curiosity. They accepted clumsiness and in potential embarrassment. They kind of had a bit of a sense of adventure. Again, there was considered risk there, but there's also like a bit of a thrill. I guess you could call it joy. So it seemed to be this beginner's mindset that allowed them to explore possibility, combined with a growth mindset that allowed them to dig deep into the lessons learned.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot. I agree as well, but it reminds me a lot of a paper we put out recently called Messy Leadership, which, and the messy, the MESSY, stood for different, mindsets and things for the leaders to learn. And a couple of them that stood out, the Y stands for your ego. So it's really putting your ego aside, like you're saying, being able to relearn and learn something different, and not be expected to be a perfectionist or that archetypal leader. And the other one was the M, which is multiple perspectives. And it's not just getting other people's viewpoints, but it's also being prepared for yourself to have a different viewpoint on something and look at something differently, as you were saying, flipping it around. Jose, I'm going to turn to you for a minute, because I don't know about you, but a lot of what we were talking about in terms of engaging stakeholders, telling a narrative, bringing people on board, sounds a lot like, community building and community activism as well. And so I'm just wondering if you're seeing these similar relationships between successful school leaders and community organizations.
I'm appreciating right now the conversation I'm hearing, because, well, something that consistently comes up is that the only thing that is consistent is change. And so for us to continually be waiting in this uncertainty, this ambiguity about what happens next, it almost secures that we need leaders who know how to be flexible, who know how to be both, consistent, but then also be able to change with the times. And so the people who I find that are most like that, as you said, Sean, were folks who are really tapped into the community, but are also really tapped into the global community writ large, right? Like a leader who serves well in one specific community shouldn't try to close off that community to others, because that's just not the way human beings work. If anything, we want leaders who have the vision to work through their students and be actively listening to students, actively listening to teachers, and then build upon those visions to help them see the world outside of the things that they know and love. So like that includes any number of communities that we either consider excellent or maybe consider so-called poor, that whole range. We could all use a whole lot more active listening and really being engaged in community in that way. And so for me, when I see leaders who really want to get a good understanding of what's happening around them don't just run off like to their own private spaces, but truly really dig deep into like what their community likes to eat, what their community like what religions that are being studied here. Are they going to those mosques? Are they going to those synagogues? Are they going to those churches and trying to figure out where folks actually convene? I mean, those are just some things that I'm thinking about right now. And I'm also thinking about what it would be like to have an activist mindset as an educator, not one that specifically adheres to one set of frameworks per se, though, of course, I do have my favorites. But it is to say that we need people who are actually being thoughtful about how they engage students so that we can actually build together. And anytime that you have folks who just want to build separately, then that often becomes a marker for trying to create more gates when we actually need less of those.
Yeah, again, agreed 100%. It just seems there was a report that came out, and I've mentioned this a couple of times, at least to people who I converse with. There was a report that came out, I think it was 2001, from the OECD, and I'm sure Catherine knows this one, called The Future of Education. And they came up with these different scenarios. And some of them were negative scenarios where it became more siloed, more gated, bigger learning gaps, opportunity gaps. But the most hopeful of them was one where they were reframing the setting of the school, not so much as a physical body, but a place where all the social services took place. And it was almost like a bus depot where people from the community would come in, get what they need, leave, come in, get what they need, leave. And they called the centers of resilience. And so they became the center of that community again, and not just in education, but in health and in welfare and in social services in general. And I see that there could be a need to move that way. Homer, before we move on to the next question, we've talked about mindsets of multiple perspectives, humility, being humble, learning new things, community activism, bringing how to communicate, knowing how to, change the narrative. I'm wondering if there are other words that come up from your side that we haven't touched on yet, or any you want to reiterate or echo.
I mean, it's an amazing list. Just, getting started with that is plenty. I guess it all sort of seems to fall under something that I mentioned, I think, in the article about sort of abundance, that it doesn't have to be an either or, an us versus them. It really is sort of, kind of just taking the limits off of learning. It's lifelong learning. It's when we talk about multiple perspectives, it's not just to benefit myself. It's how much are we as a community gaining when we learn from each other? And that's the experience of the world now. So you can't go back. And I think the other reality is that most adults were not educated in that way. And so that is part of our own learning that we have to embrace, is this much more abundant, much more humble. Multiple perspectives means there are multiple approaches. It doesn't have to be a yes or no, clear cut, you're with us or against us. That just doesn't work anymore. So, and we see this in kind of creative solutions across, whether it's building new schools or the situation in Ukraine. It's the creative solutionary sort of movement that is getting people excited and bringing people together. And so I think that creates big challenges when you're leading education, because what does school look like? To your point about the different scenarios.
Yeah. And so maybe an add-on to that leadership skill and that narrative or that communication is not just the narrative to the direct stakeholders, the teachers, the students, and so forth, but a narrative to the broader community about this is what school is, this is what school is becoming, it's different, and the leader needs to be able to articulate what that different is so that, they're engaging, the whole community in this. Okay, Homer, let's stick with you. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, thank you for sticking with me. I was actually going to just add on a quick comment to what you're saying. A really remarkable experience that we've had prior to COVID, but really intensely during COVID, has been working with what we think of as guiding coalitions that are very community centered in schools around the world, getting parents, leaders, students, teachers, different community members to come in and talk about important things for the school. And one of the ways that we begin the conversation thinking about the future is we go into our 9 Big Questions book. That's a free download. Our very first question in the 9 Big Questions is, what is sacred? And so before we move on to where we want to go into the future, we pause and have everybody think about, if you were to look at your school 10, 20 years into the future, you were to come back, what would you hope was still here? And when you hear from this multitude of voices about what matters the most, that becomes a really powerful foundation and a sort of common denominator that across, a 7th grade student to a board member, they're sharing what is sacred to them, and you can really build a lot from there, and it demonstrates these powerful mindsets as well, I think. So just to share, that's been a really remarkable experience that anyone can do with their school community.
And I hear that a lot from the successful ventures about planning for the future is not starting and jumping way ahead onto what might be or could be, but it's really basing people in that foundation of what is core, what is, as you say, sacred. What are the mindsets or the dispositions or the understandings and beliefs that you really want to see fostered and thrive in this community? And because too often in education, we go off on these tangents which are well-meaning, and we never discuss the core, or we assume that everybody has that same understanding of that core of what's sacred. Let's jump on to the next question. Here's a couple of the quotes, by the way, that we had from the panelists that were in that article as well, and most of them have been touched on. But let's talk about now the flip side of that. So the skills and the mindsets that we will need our schools for the future. So this is really talking more about what are some of those sacred things really that you were talking about, Homer. What are those things that we know are core to what we want, or core to what we know is going to be successful in this uncertain world moving forward? And Homer, I don't know if you want to keep the stage and kick us off on this one, but you're more than welcome to.
I'll start just to ground in what everybody says is the most sacred. And it's always relationship. It's always connection. It's always belonging, tied really closely with equity and inclusion, and joy, and curiosity, wonder. It's never grades. It's never content. It's never, those things that many people are spending the most time and resources on. But it's always those other, I guess, more sort of abundant, human-centered skills and mindsets.
And I'll jump ahead and just show, these are some of the quotes that Homer and also Jose had in the article. Jose, I don't know if you want to touch on what you were talking about in this quote to the audience.
Yeah, I mean, I did talk a little bit about active listening and deep engagement earlier, but I saw the words addressing diversity, and of course it's worth thinking about, especially as there's been more drive more drives out there to try to recruit and retain teachers of color throughout the United States. At this point in time, we are at the highest clip of teachers of color being recruited and since the early 80s, I think, which is when they first started being recorded for racial demographics. But we're also at a point when teachers of color are leaving their roles far more quickly than their white counterparts. And so it's interesting because, you know, there's this burgeoning body of research that suggests that teachers of color are more likely to refer their students to AP and honors classes. They're more likely to reduce disciplinary action, more likely to actually seek alternative methods besides suspension and detention, if I'm not mistaken, in more recent times. And in fact, teachers of color are very beneficial for students across the board. It isn't just race matching, it's literally like every student, including white students. And so they're more likely to push students to higher education as well, across the board as well. But of course, what also happens too is that our schools are not allowing or making permissible for educators of color, Black educators, brown educators, so on and so forth, even our Asian educators, which unfortunately, like, we're seeing so many different renditions of the definition of Asian for a lot of different people, whether it be, you know, our Far East folks or our folks who are down Southeast, etc. We need to have a better conversation about what diversity looks like, especially as we're trying to move into the future. Our public schools right now are predominantly students of color. I think we just crossed that threshold 2 years ago, and that number is only going to grow as well. And so I get concerned when school leaders, for example, are not hiring for diversity more often, not as a way to say we just need to change the faces, but also to change the direction of how our schools are being seen and how our students feel seen and feel like they belong within classrooms. What a powerful message it is for our students to see a plethora of adults with a plethora of experiences all throughout their K through 12 career, and them having been exposed to so many different cultures and values and understandings, and how we then build towards a future that is truly inclusive and truly collective in that way. That's that deep engagement that I would love to see, and not just public schools, but every single school, independent schools, private schools, religious schools as well. So that's something I'm consistently thinking about, and again, not just change the faces, but also to ensure that we have multiple experiences represented within our own space.
Just chime in on that. I just love what you just said, because it actually simply states what can actually be very complex to explain to people around diversity and inclusion. And people, the language gets in the way of the conversation at times because it stumbles over equity and it collides with inclusion and it bumps into diversity, and it gets kind of complicated because it is complicated. But I think what I heard you saying just then, which I thought was really sweet, was, you know, securing diversity in one sense is easy. It's a matter of doing things to tick the box on a scorecard. But feeling included, being valued, being represented, being seen and heard, and having control, that's the stuff that actually sticks people to organizations. That's the stuff that unlocks the potential that everyone has. They just don't have the same opportunity. So I really liked what you said then, and I describe it as, you know, diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion, well, that's how you feel when you're invited to dance.
Yeah, that's nice. It was in all the responses that we got from the panelists, but also from the school leaders as well, about these skills for the future. There was such a lot around inclusion, personalization, diversity. And when you think about it, even the last 5-10 years, we've gone from quite a big major shift in understanding that in order for someone to learn and to thrive and to flourish, and this is obvious when you say it, but it's taken us a decade or more to understand it, they need to feel cared for, they need to feel like they belong, They need to feel listened to. They need to feel like they have a voice. And I think we're starting to look at how we can scale that up in a major way across education. Other thoughts before we jump on to the last couple of questions, and I will mention to people who have your questions, type them into the Q&A function, and I'll be able to read them out. But thought from the other panelists about the skills for the future.
Well, I would just jump in really fast and say, I think that, we're going to have to, leaders are going to have to become better storytellers. I think part of the reason why we're kind of stuck in these normals that have produced results, as Otto Scharmer says, that nobody really wants, is that the narratives that we associate with education in schools run really deep. And so we're going to have to change those narratives. We're going to have to change those stories. We're going to have to change the way that we talk about learning in schools. We're going to have to open up the scope of how people can entertain what learning looks like in schools, and even the role of schools. In our work, sometimes we get a lot of pushback and say, and people will say, well, we're constrained by the state or provincial expectations, or by the standardized tests, or by fill in the blank. And there's no question that there are many constraints. But when we ask, is there no place in your school where interesting things, where kids are doing having powerful experiences around learning and problem solving and inquiry and all that, everyone says, sure. And then, well, why aren't we telling those stories? Why are we centering the stories of how good our test scores are and where kids are going to college, instead of the stories about kids who are helping people in the community, who are coming up with beautiful, creative designs for all sorts of things that show learning in a more relevant, in a more kind of applicable sense to the ways in which, again, the world is kind of operating today. So I do think that, we're going to have to build the capacity of leadership to be great narrators of a different vision for the ways in which schools can operate, and the experience of school for what that can become, and to tell those stories really widely and to really be consistent in the ways that they tell them.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that actually probably leads us on to this last question, because I think from what I'm hearing, the skills of storytelling and the narrative is going to play into both leading into the future and for the future as well. So are these skills the same is the last real question. So when we're talking about, leading into the future, preparing our schools for change, to be nimble, to bring people on board, or the skills for the future, are these the same things? And then a subsequent question, because this came up a lot in the comments, was there was an underpinning on the focus of equity, and really, should equity be our driver as we start to look towards the future? And Catherine, maybe I'll start with you on this one to get your input.
I absolutely think that equity, or even reaching further, as our forecast says, liberation, should be the driver, really for the inherent value of that. And if we think about it societally, we're facing really shared existential challenges at this time, with the decline of democracy that was cited, the threats of climate change, some of the impacts of accelerating technologies. And we have a lot to figure out together as people. And if we think about education's role in society, we really need to make sure that we're helping to enable everybody to contribute to the future that we co-create together, to their fullest. And I think for leaders, one of the big things is to help to bring people together across differences, and to foster social cohesion, to say we may have our differences, we do have our differences, but we can have a sense of a shared destination, a shared endeavor together across that. So as we look to some of the future possibilities related to prospects for liberatory education, that we really felt like that was one of the biggest drivers, that ability to foster social cohesion, and determining what kinds of futures we might create in the next couple of decades.
I'll pick up on the
sort of other thoughts. Go ahead. Go
yeah.
ahead.
I'll pick up on the liberatory. I think I'm really glad, Catherine, that you use that term and that you brought that up. And I think, you know, part of the narrative is pushing ourselves a little farther. So even as, you know, we talk about diversity, inclusion, being invited to the dance, asked to dance, I think it goes even farther. Liberatory means that who is, maybe it's not just being invited to the table, but it's building a different table. And like, what's the playlist? Who gets to pick that playlist that you're just assuming I'm happy to dance to? Or, you know, it's a lot that goes behind that. And it is it's a profound process. So I think it's vital and it's challenging, but it takes us even farther. And that's where I think we are all being pushed to learn, you know, it's like new language, new power of the language in addition to a new story. So yeah, I do think it is underpinning. You're not going to get far without equity on any of these points. And really it taking it to a liberatory learning idea is really important.
Can anybody see any differences in the skill sets that we talked about from leading into the future and for the future? You know, one tended to be a little bit more broader, and so really looking at that storytelling, the narrative, different ways of different perspectives on things. The into the future was more looking at the personalization, inclusion. Are there different skills that people can see in either one of these two buckets, or are they all somewhat similar?
I guess, Sean, I actually wrestled with the two questions and the nuance between them. And in the end, the way that I kind of made sense in my simple mind around them was, you know, as a leader, let's say you're an executive leader or a system leader or in the ministry, whatever it might be, you know, there's stuff that needs to be done right now. That's the relevance of the situation. This is contextual intelligence right now. So there's an agenda right pressing now. We've touched on it in this conversation around supply demand issues of quality teachers and teaching, quality leaders and leadership. You know, there's pressing demands right now around meeting the needs of increasingly diverse learner cohorts, accelerating learning, catch up, keep up, get ahead, well-being. These are all very present. So that's a skill set involved in navigating the now. There is a nuanced skill set and mindset for navigating towards the next, the preferred future. And again, when I'm interviewing people, what I'm getting a sense of is that they're, number one, excellent at the now, but number two, they're constantly leaning in and pushing towards the next. So there's both this kind of, future-focused mindset. And then at the same time, they're very clear about what's relevant and what matters most right now at the same time. And they seem to be able to bring those two together in order to lead effectively now and into the future.
Yeah, very nice. Excellent. We do have a couple of questions which I'll throw at people as well, metaphorically, of course, but we are, as always, running out of time. So don't feel that you need to actually answer everyone that comes along. But there's one question: are there any good resources to learn more specifically on liberation and social cohesion in education? And another question that came in the Q&A, is there a good example or a best of example that you know right now where the leader has been leading for the future over the last couple of years? So I'll leave those open to anybody. And we do have Catherine's link in there as well into the chat, so thank you very much.
I've just dropped the link, not to be a shameless self-promoter, but I've dropped the link to the Super Speak podcast just because it is kind of active listening of leaders who are leading right now. Education's in a tricky inflection point, right? It's a curious and exciting and confounding and stressful spot for everyone to be. Again, listening to those leaders, I'm constantly reminded of this ability, this capacity, this mindset they have to really be concerned about what happens Monday, not just someday, but at the same time to be also thoughtful about how we're navigating forwards and making decisions now that are going to play out into the future around the broader purpose for education, the broader agenda around skilling and readiness for our young people. And importantly, what kinds of leaders and leadership preparation is required to induct those, so we're not just growing leaders for the past, but we're actually actively growing leaders with the mindset and skill set for the future, which is an interesting piece of work that's there's some research on that in one of the podcasts that if I can remember it, I'll send it to you, Sean, to distribute afterwards.
Yeah, excellent. And there's also a great example from Oliver Brachard over in France as well, that he's put into the chat box as well. Very quickly, we're almost out of time, so I'm not going to give you the 1 minute of actions that you would like to take, but maybe there is a word of wisdom that you can each sum up around this topic of leading into and for the future. And we'll go back with the same order. So, Homer, we will start with you. Quick
I was
action
looking
or
for a resource. Okay, wait, what is it? I lost you there for a sec.
One summary.
Oh,
That's all right.
okay. I'm thinking of a quote that I love. Okay, I'm thinking of a quote that I love from Miriam Kaba that starts with "Hope is a discipline." So I have hope, and I strive to root it in action.
Very nice. Will?
Well, it kind of goes to our work, the heart of our work, but it is to be fearless in the questions that you ask, to be willing to go there and unpack the stuff that may be really hard to unpack, but we all need to do that right now, I think.
Yeah, nice. Jose?
I would just add that Educolor has a bunch of different resources on its website as well. I left a little link there for everybody, including some things that are current and relevant, which is, I think, so critical to trying to move towards the future. We can't do it without context. We have to get really rooted in what's happening in the here and now. And it seems really dire right now to really say, like, hey, we got some good work to do. And I hope that leaders are able to take that on, whether you're a teacher leader from the classroom or you're a superintendent or someone who's trying to lead the nation or the world in education. I would love to see more people get relevant and ready to do that work.
Yeah, and see us as, community organizers and, potentially activists as well. Catherine, word of wisdom?
I would just encourage folks to really question our assumptions about how things have to be and imagine alongside others, possibilities that might really seem like a stretch today. But if we let ourselves dream like that, despite the current challenges, then we'll have more space to move forward together.
Yeah, and make sure you read the report that Catherine put up there as well. They're always great reading.
Thank you.
And Mark, you get the final say.
Oh, look at that. Easy optimism. It's always a choice.
Very true. Very true. All right. I want to thank all of our panelists for putting up with my technical difficulties here, which we still seem to be having with this webinar. It's been a really great discussion. This will be recorded and go live up on our YouTube site probably in the next couple of days, and we'll let everybody who signed up know about that and also be alerted to it via email. Rest assured that we also have at BTS Spark, a lot of our work is focused around developing leaders for the future, the next generation of leaders, and we do that via coaching, either one-to-one or small groups. So please have a look at the BTS Spark website as well, and have a look at our YouTube site for all of the last 6-7 months of webinars that we've had with some really great speakers. But thank you very much, everybody.